Thank you so much, Alex, for that very warm introduction. And thank you to the Center for Civil and Human Rights for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for coming. I should also thank particularly Chris Sevenik and Ann Rorden and Kevin Fine for making this such a flawless arrival. This is actually my second trip to Notre Dame, and I'm delighted to be back. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't thank Alexandra Levy, who is the real reason that I'm here, because Alexandra has worked with me since the very beginning. And for all of you law students out there, you are so fortunate to have her on your faculty, because she is a brilliant lawyer who also does math, which will become apparent why that's important in just a moment. And finally, I'd like to thank the Pasquale family as well, and thank Pam for being here today. So with that, I want to start today. Most trafficking meetings, most trafficking conversations are a litany of really bad news, a litany of really bad numbers, and a litany of sort of stories of failure. And so what I wanted to do today is turn that paradigm on its head and talk about what's working. Because there is hope, and some things are working, we just have to get better at those things. So let me start with this. I was here 4 years ago, and I put up this slide, and I asked the question I'm about to ask now, which is, how many of you have seen the movie Taken? Okay, now, just for the record, I asked last time, and I'm going to ask you now. I hate this movie. Why do you think I hate this movie? And some brilliant law student last time I was here said, bad acting. So, which is true. But other than the really bad acting, why would someone who works on human trafficking hate this movie? Any ideas?
Well, I've never seen this movie, actually. I can imagine someone might hate it because it portrays a hackneyed and inaccurate narrative.
Yes, it gives the
impression of this question.
Any other ideas for people who have seen the movie? Why would a human trafficking expert hate this movie? Yeah.
Maybe it proposes violence as a solution.
Yes. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, Dad, Liam Neeson, is a former CIA operative who goes to Paris to rescue his daughter who's being sold at an auction to a slave harem. I've done this work for 25 years, never actually seen that particular scenario. And Dad goes to Paris, guns blazing, kills probably about 40 people, and then boards a private jet and returns to the United States with his daughter safely in tow. It's absurd. And what it does is reinforce this narrative, as Alex says, of rescue. This idea that trafficking victims have to be rescued through violence. That trafficking victims actually have no agency of their own. So I can't stand this movie. It also gives the impression that all trafficking is sex trafficking. And you could be forgiven for believing that if all you do is read the papers. But if you actually delve deeply into the indictments, you realize that actually the vast majority of trafficking around the world is for forced labor and not for sex. The one thing that this movie does get right, however, is corruption. That's the one thing it gets right. There's a scene in the movie where Liam Neeson, master CIA operative who actually guards Beyonce now that he's retired, and rescues his daughter who's in fabulous levels of violence in Paris. He goes to visit his buddy, who's head of the Parisian police force, who is on the take from the Albanian mobsters who have trafficked his daughter. That story of corruption, a minor, tiny subplot within the full movie, is probably the only part that's right. Because corruption is a major factor in all forms of human trafficking. A lot of trafficking, unlike what you might see in the movie Taken, looks more like this. The Associated Press just won a Pulitzer Prize. The New York Times has done extensive reporting on trafficking of people into forced labor in supply chains, including on vessels like this one, where they are fishing. Men on these vessels are trapped, sometimes for years. They never get back to land. They never see their families. They are held entirely incommunicado. The ships themselves remain at sea fed by a mother vessel. The mother vessel comes and collects the fish and drops off additional food. But if you're hurt on one of these vessels, if you're trafficked onto these vessels, there's little chance you're getting off. One of our board members, a brilliant writer named Ben Skinner, who wrote a book called A Crime So Monstrous, wrote a piece in Bloomberg several years ago about Indonesian fishermen held on fishing boats, Korean flag vessels, in New Zealand waters. Some of those fishermen managed to escape to New Zealand, thinking that they would be safe in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, they were arrested and detained. Because trafficking victims around the world, by and large, are not treated as victims, they're treated as criminals, detained and deported, even now when we should know better. Ben interviewed those Indonesian men held on shipping vessels, and what they learned was there was forced labor, they weren't paid, they didn't have their documents, they couldn't escape. None of that surprised him. What did surprise Ben was that some of these men were also sexually violated by the leaders on the ships. So one thing that we see in the forced labor space, even in supply chains, is this intersection between forced sex and forced labor. Ben said that was the last thing he ever expected. So the ILO has just come out with new data. Now it's more than 40 million, but I'm going to look back at the old data because the new data is just sort of filtering through the system and there's some skepticism about the new data. If you look at the old data, the ILO said that there were 20.9 million people. The new number is 24.9 million people held in both forced sexual commercial exploitation or sexual exploitation of children and all forms of forced labor, both state-sponsored, by which we mean prison labor, so state-sponsored labor, and also labor in the private sector, the kinds of fishing boats, domestic servitude, other forms of forced labor. But if you look at this pie, 16.4 million of the total 20.9 are held in forced labor of a non-sexual variety. So even though all the sex trafficking gets all the news and all the headlines, what we see beneath the surface is actually quite a lot of labor trafficking and forced labor around the globe. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because the major remedy that's prescribed is prosecution. Right? The major remedy that we use to combat human trafficking is criminal prosecution. So if you look at this number, these are State Department statistics. 14,897 is the number total of all prosecutions around the entire world for all forms of trafficking, which is pretty mind-boggling, right? Remember, our number is 20.9 million, and we have fewer than 15,000 prosecutions. But the other thing that worries me is this number, the number in parentheses, 1,038. That's the number of prosecutions for forced labor in the entire world. If you think about that for a moment, 1,038, we're talking about more than 16 million cases and just over 1,000 prosecutions. This is a crime that you can commit with total impunity. Trafficking occurs in a whole variety of sectors. I'm not making any of this up. Like, I got this from indictments. My favorite is the Bridal Shop, which was a trafficking case brought in Flagstaff, Arizona, of people who owned a bridal shop, brought victims into the United States from Vietnam, had them in the back of the bridal shop, dyeing fabrics, dyeing shoes, making alterations. But the allegations in the indictment were that those people in the bridal shop, who were also, by the way, doing all the domestic work back at the house that the traffickers owned, but those individuals were held in forced labor. Hair braiding salons we'll talk about in a moment. Chicken debeaking. Some of you may have seen recently the news articles about men and women who thought that they were going to drug rehabilitation in Oklahoma and instead ended up in a drug rehabilitation program with one drug counselor who was licensed, and ended up as their drug rehab program eviscerating chickens and debeaking chickens in a chicken butchery plant. So that case isn't being criminally prosecuted. There's a civil case on those particular facts. But the idea that people who are actually butchering chickens and eviscerating chickens in meat processing plants are trafficked in our own supply chains here in the United States, I think doesn't occur to most people. All right, so now for the good news. I've already loaded you down with all the bad news. There are no prosecutions, it's everywhere. But here's the good news. And I just want to go over 5 innovations and then leave lots of time for questions. And if you have questions while I'm talking, please interrupt me. I'll be happy to sort of stop and answer your questions. So please, with that. So innovation number 1 is my personal favorite because this is what Alex and I do, which is strategic litigation. And how many of you here do strategic litigation or have been involved in strategic litigation or want to be involved in strategic litigation? Great. I know you do this in Pullman. And there's also, I think, at the center currently, one of your LLM students is a strategic litigator from Kazakhstan. Is that it? So this is something that is actually taking hold around the globe. So what do I mean when I'm talking about strategic litigation? In the United States, Congress, which does so many things wrong, did one thing right. You have to be happy when they do something right. In 2003, they expanded the law and gave us the power to bring civil cases against traffickers in federal courts. That's pretty remarkable, and I'll tell you why it's remarkable. Before this law passed, I would sit in my office with trafficking victims. We would go over their stories. I would apply for visas for them to remain in the United States. We would go to the FBI. We would go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We would beg for a prosecution, literally. My clients wanted to participate. These were all victims of forced labor, but they wanted their traffickers brought to justice, and they wanted their back wages. They wanted to be paid. They had been robbed. One of our clients was held for 19 years and never paid in domestic servitude. So sitting in the office with clients weeping, because there would be no federal prosecution because the prosecutors had declined, meaning that that victim would never get a day in court. All that changed in 2003 with this innovation that we could now bring civil cases. And in 2008, Congress again did something right. They amended the law so that now we can bring extraterritorial cases in U.S. courts. So if the perpetrator is a U.S. citizen, a green card holder, or in the United States for any purpose, we can tag that person and bring a civil suit against them, but we can also prosecute them criminally. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. And so what we've been doing is trying to let people, particularly in communities where trafficking is occurring abroad, know that these cases can be brought into the U.S. courts. You know, for those of you who follow the Alien Tort Statute, you can see the incredibly closing doors of federal courthouses, right? The cases that can be brought in federal courts are being shrunk on a daily basis. But this is one area where the doors are flown wide open. So remember the picture that I showed you of the men on the fishing boat? That's what this looks like in court. Not just any court, in California, in federal court in the Western Division. So this is a case brought by an amazing group of pro bono lawyers in Washington, D.C., a firm called Cohen Milstein. They have an endowed human rights chair. How many law firms have that? It's pretty remarkable. Aneshka Friesman, who's probably one of the most outstanding anti-trafficking litigators in this country, brought this case on behalf of men and women from Cambodia who alleged that they were held in forced labor in a fish processing plant, a seafood processing plant in Thailand. None of these facts occurred on U.S. soil. None of the plaintiffs are American. The defendants do have offices in the United States. Some of these are U.S. companies. This case has already survived motions to dismiss. And so the case is now proceeding and has recently moved into discovery. But in terms of tools that we have at our disposal, this is an example of what can be done by very smart lawyers who are creative. And let me just drop a footnote. Remember, I mentioned that the extraterritorial jurisdiction covers both criminal and civil cases. But guess how many supply chain, forced labor, extraterritorial cases the Department of Justice has done? 0. Right? So the civil bar is way out ahead on this. It's not just cases abroad that are coming into U.S. courts. The Southern Poverty Law Center brought an incredibly important case. And this is a picture of Dan Werner, again, one of the most brilliant litigators in the United States. Dan Werner and his colleagues brought a case involving more than 400 workers from India. These were workers who were highly skilled. They were welders, they were builders. They were brought into the United States all on legal visas, issued by the State Department and with certifications issued by the Department of Labor, brought into the United States to repair shipyards after Hurricane Katrina. The owners of the company realized, Signal International, that they could save a lot of money if they didn't pay Americans, if they didn't pay unions, if they just brought in workers from India who were easily exploited. The men in India who had jobs, who were skilled workers, saw an advertisement in the newspaper in India that said, you can get a green card and bring your family to the United States. Just apply for this job. So when they got into the process of applying, they discovered, oh, so we can get that visa and we can eventually get those green cards if we just pay between $10,000 and $25,000 to the labor recruiters. So they borrowed money, they sold their land, they mortgaged everything, they sold their wives' jewelry. They scraped up the money to pay the labor recruiters to get these fabulous jobs in the United States for an excellent wage with a contract, thinking it was all perfectly legal. And then when they got here, they found out it was not as promised. There were no green cards. Their families were definitely not coming over. The work was not as promised. They were paid far less than promised. An enormous problem because many of them had debts back in India that they had to service that had enormous and overwhelming interest rates, compounding daily. The men were housed in a completely horrendous man camp on bunk beds. They each had a little tiny locker. For the privilege of living in the man camp, Signal International charged each of these men more than $1,000 a month directly from their wages in rent. When some of the men said, I would like to live in the town instead, they were told they could do that, but the rent would still be deducted. So they could pay rent twice. When the Southern Poverty Law Center did the actual discovery on this case, they found correspondence within company files that was provided in discovery that called the man camp a profit center for the company, because the company was making so much money off of extorting the rent from these workers. So this case went to trial. So few of our cases go to trial. It went to a jury. The jury saw the first 5 victims. There were multiple cases lined up like dominoes to file, to go to court in different jurisdictions. The first case went 5 victims. The verdict was $14 million. Signal International, I think they must have done the math because they realized with hundreds more plaintiffs waiting to go to trial, with multiple additional trials just in the months ahead, if every case went as well for the plaintiffs as this one did, they would be in the hole literally hundreds of millions of dollars. And so they filed bankruptcy. The Wall Street Journal reported on this case in a blog. The Wall Street Journal reporter said, we always knew that trafficking was morally bankrupt, but now we have learned from the Signal case that it can also financially bankrupt a company. What's interesting about this case is that Dan Werner from the Southern Poverty Law Center brilliantly lined up an array of some of the best pro bono lawyers in the United States. some of the largest firms in the United States, including bankruptcy lawyers from Skadden. The bankruptcy lawyers from Skadden negotiated a $20 million settlement for all of the victims as part of the bankruptcy, which is pretty remarkable. So these are the kinds of cases. Again, that's not an extraterritorial case. That's forced labor that happened right here in the United States, right in New Orleans. So if you're interested in using strategic litigation for human trafficking cases, we actually wrote a report about it, and you can get this on our website. It's easy to find. And it's a short report, but it provides some examples of cases that are moving through the courts currently. But it's not just U.S. courts, because strategic litigation is an idea that has caught on across the globe. This is a case brought by a non-governmental organization in Canada, along with a number of private law firms in Canada, against Nevson, a Canadian mining company that went to Eritrea. And in Eritrea, for those of you who know, there is forced state-sponsored labor. There's a kind of draft system, and everyone has to work for the state. In the Nevson case, the plaintiffs, who were Eritrean victims who worked in the mine, alleged that Nevson was in cahoots with the government of Eritrea, and that all the workers in the mine were held in forced labor. So this case has also now passed multiple motions to dismiss. Just about 2 weeks ago, it passed the final hurdle, and now it's on its way to trial in Canadian courts. And it's not just Canada, although I will, to be fair, say that it's mostly common law countries. This is a case brought by a wonderful firm in Britain called Lee Day. The woman who litigated this case is one of the former strategic litigators from Amnesty International. She brought that ethos of human rights litigation into the civil rights firm Lee Day in London, and they brought a case on behalf of Lithuanian men. Again, do you notice that many of these cases are involving men? We tend to think that trafficking is only women and girls or women and children, but these are adult men. Men from Lithuania brought to the United Kingdom, to Kent, to work on a farm where their job was chasing and beaking chickens on a farm, for which they were paid close to nothing. The verdict in this particular case was approximately £750,000, which is a lot for a British court. In the U.S. cases, we routinely win millions of dollars, but £750,000 is a lot in the British context. They have lower damages rates. Nevertheless, this is a case that was brought as strategic litigation as a civil matter in Britain, and it was not prosecuted in Britain. Not prosecuted. So what is prosecuted? Well, unfortunately, I can give you an example of another case. It was children from Vietnam brought to Britain to mine marijuana in illegal marijuana grows. Those children were trafficked, held in forced labor. Guess who was arrested? The children. Guess who was prosecuted? The children. And so there was one really amazing pro bono barrister in London who managed to get all of those convictions vacated. But we cannot trust prosecution at this point to be the method to combat trafficking. We need more. I've talked a lot about forced labor because that's where most of the time I live when I'm in the courtroom, but these cases have now also been brought against hotels. Because part of the law says if you financially benefit knowingly from a venture that you knew or should have known is human trafficking, you too can be held liable. So this is actually a state case brought against a hotel in Philadelphia where the victim, who's a sex trafficking victim, alleges that the hotel owners knew, and that they colluded with the traffickers to keep her in forced prostitution in that hotel. And mind you, she was a child. The perfect example of this is a criminal parallel case in New Orleans. In New Orleans, federal prosecutors did bring a case against a hotel owner where the hotel owner charged extra when he knew there was commercial sex in the room because of the extra wear and tear on the carpet and the beds. So he wanted to charge extra for commercial sex. Okay, if he doesn't know it's a child, if it's not a child, then he just knows there's commercial sex. You still have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. One day, the hotel owner goes into one of these rooms where he knows there's commercial sex. There's blood everywhere, broken furniture, broken commode. The owner turns to the trafficker and says, just give me some extra money. I'll clean the room. We'll call it a day, and I won't call the cops. So now you've nailed it, right? You have all the elements of the crime. You have commercial sex, and you have force, fraud, or coercion, because you know that this woman has been beaten severely. The prosecutors managed to get a plea deal on that case, so we don't have any good case law, but we have a fantastic press release, right, that talks about what prosecutors were able to do. So these cases, these third-party hotel financially benefiting cases, which are also civil cases for damages, these cases are moving through the federal and the state courts as well. All right, innovation number 2, use of financial data. This is one of my favorites because we depend so much on trafficking victims to testify. What we need is corroborating evidence, and financial data can do 2 things. It can provide corroborating evidence, and it can also reveal trafficking. The idea is much like the Al Capone theory of prosecution. If you can't nail them on A, nail them on B, but you follow the money. So where does the money take us? This is an amazing case. This is a case of a Ukrainian gang of brothers, 5 brothers, who recruited workers from Ukraine to come to the United States, telling them they'd have great jobs in the United States, except when they got here, the women were raped, the men were beaten, they weren't paid, and they were working all night, every night, cleaning big box stores like Walmart. So if you ever wondered who the cleaning crews were in Walmart at night, they might actually be trafficked persons, in this case from Ukraine. The way this case was busted, I think Alex and I have this, we love finding out how cases are busted. This is the best thing, to figure out how the cases were identified, because there are lessons to be learned from that. So in this one, it was Western Union transfers. The government of Poland and the government of Ukraine alerted the FBI to transfers through Western Union that were unimaginably high and also inexplicable. Unfortunately, this one, like so many mutual legal assistance treaty requests and LAT requests, this one sat on someone's desk for a very long time, right? Prosecutors are notoriously slow at responding to requests for assistance from other countries. But in this case, the FBI pulled off a brilliant move. They matched up the suspicious activity reports, the reports from the government in Poland and Ukraine about suspicious financial transactions. They matched them up and lined them up with testimony that they had gotten in San Diego of one of the boxing victims who was on a day. They managed somehow to put these 2 things together, and they managed to identify one of the largest criminal trafficking cases on forced labor brought in that part of the country. Or this. This is a case involving, again, forced labor. Mr. Ashraf Khojayev was an Uzbek national who ran a company. His company was called Giant Labor Solutions. It was run out of Kansas City, Missouri. Not a place that you necessarily think of as a hub of human trafficking, but Mr. Ashraf Khojayev was very entrepreneurial, and he brought in hundreds of workers from multiple countries, and he put them to work in fancy hotels. Hotels that you have undoubtedly stayed in. Now notice, this is a RICO case. This is the very first RICO case, racketeering case, where one of the underlying crimes is forced labor. So it's a historic case, but here's the interesting part. The money laundering counts in this case include all of the hotels that had employed workers from Giant Labor Solutions. So Giant Labor Solutions provided these hotels with housekeeping staff. The hotel said, too much hassle to employ these people directly. We have to pay workers' comp, such a pain in the neck. We'll just subcontract this out to Giant Labor Solutions. What a great idea. Except they paid Giant Labor Solutions for the work, but Giant Labor Solutions didn't pay the workers. In this case, there were even checks for 2 weeks of work, for hours and hours of work. for 0. So when you look at the restitution order, which is the order at the end of the case ordering compensation to the victims were, of course, the workers. So this is one of the workers. That's how much money he was earned in back wages. He was owed in back wages. They also managed to defraud an insurance company. But more importantly to the government, they defrauded the Internal Revenue Service, right? Because not only were they not paying the workers, they also were not paying employment taxes, right? So now a lot of the task forces across the United States, and this is a really good sign, the Human Trafficking Task Forces, I serve on the DC one, they have them all over the country, they're bringing in IRS agents because following the money means making sure that people who are legitimate employers are actually paying employment taxes and workman's compensation, because if they're not, it should be a red flag. So the non-governmental organizations got together with Cyrus Vance Jr., the Manhattan DA's office, and also the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and we developed a list of red flags, which we then gave to the banks. And we said to the banks, here are red flags that you should watch out for. For example, people who pay wages but don't pay employment taxes. For example, people who are issuing wage checks for 0, or worse than that, issuing wage checks for -15, right? Because you haven't managed to pay off enough of your debt, so now you have a wage check for -$15. So these red flags we gave to the banks. The banks have to provide reporting on suspicious activities to the Manhattan DA's office and to the Federal Treasury. And so now the banks are actually reporting suspicious activity. And like the Botswana case, those suspicious activity reports are generating materials. The thing that I love most is that, interestingly enough, the Department of Justice has hired a full-time federal prosecutor who's an expert on human trafficking to sit in the money laundering and asset recovery section. So in the money laundering section of DOJ, there's one lawyer totally dedicated to finding assets and doing financial investigation, criminal investigations, and trafficking cases. Okay, innovation number 3, linking corruption and trafficking. We talked about this a little bit in the beginning because it's the only part of Taken that I like. Alex mentioned the International Bar Association. So the International Bar Association had a presidential task force on human trafficking. And the members of the task force got together and we decided, okay, we're going to do a report, but what should it be on? And we decided the most underreported part of trafficking was the link of corruption. So as our methodology, we decided that we would only write about cases that were adjudicated, right? They had been indicted, there was a criminal investigation. We didn't want to report on like gossip and garbage. So that was our standard. So in this report, we started looking for cases, press reports, criminal cases, et cetera, that we could use. We found some amazing cases. One of the cases is here in the United States. It involves a border guard working for the federal government. There was a victim who was going to testify against her trafficker. It was a labor trafficking case. She had been held in domestic servitude. She was ready to testify. Of course, Customs and Border Protection, ICE, they knew where she was. And so one of them, in exchange for a bribe, showed up on her doorstep one morning and told her that she was being deported and took her to the airport to deport her so that she couldn't testify. Wasn't even that big a bribe. The irony of writing this report on public corruption and using actual indictments and actual adjudicated cases as the standard. When we looked at our data, what we realized, based on the number of cases that we had in the report, and this was partly a function of being English speakers and only being able to read in English and Russian and a couple of other languages, we discovered that the United States, if you look at adjudicated cases, is the most corrupt country in the world. But that's not true, right? That's not accurate. What we are is the most likely country to prosecute corrupt actors. Right? So that was actually a positive finding rather than a negative finding. I can only wish that all of the countries around the world would adopt a standard of rule of law so that they're going after their corrupt actors as well. But that's one report that you can take a look at if you're interested in these links. And there are a lot of Very good sort of case examples of how this works in, as we say, in real life, IRL. It's not just the International Bar Association that's been working on this. There's an organization called Liberty Asia that partnered with Ropes & Gray, a wonderful large pro bono law firm, law offices in China, and the Freedom Fund, and they wrote an entire report on modern slavery and corruption and did something really interesting. If we're not getting prosecutions for trafficking, maybe we can get prosecutions for bribery. So that's another sort of innovative way, sort of back channel to capture traffickers, because trafficking so frequently has bribery involved in the entire conspiracy and scheme. So maybe we can go after that. So what some very sort of creative advocates now are doing is going to the Department of Justice, not to the trafficking section, but going to the fraud section and other sections that are responsible for prosecutions under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, in order to get bribery prosecutions that are, at heart, actually trafficking cases. So what does that look like? How many of you followed this scandal with the U.S. Navy? Anybody seen this? This has been front page news in Washington and the Washington Post. This is a really amazing case. Fat Leonard, this guy's nickname. Fat Leonard owned a company that provided sort of maritime services. So when Navy ships pull into a port, they have to be serviced. So Fat Leonard decided, you know what? I can make so much more money if I know which ship is coming into port when. The only problem here is it's all classified, right? We don't announce ahead of time that a particular ship or submarine is coming into port. So Fat Leonard decided, you know what I'll do? I will simply bribe all the naval officials so that they tell me in advance and leak all this classified information to me, which they did. So Craig Whitlock has been covering this. This is the reporter for the Washington Post. He has been covering this doggedly. It has brought down multiple admirals. This bribery scandal has brought down multiple officers, multiple sort of, captains of various vessels, because they were all providing information. So what were the bribes? Okay, money, that's easy. Fancy dinners, also easy. Fabulous wines, also easy. But also sex parties and prostitutes. So I called Craig Whitlock at the Washington Post. And I said to him, Craig, did you actually dig any deeper? Did you ever ask whether any of the prostitutes that you put in the headline are trafficked? Right? It's entirely possible that they're working voluntarily as sex workers. If they're adults and they volunteer to work as sex workers, this isn't an issue. However, if they are children, or if they are being held in prostitution through force, fraud, or coercion, this is a totally different story. And the reporter said to me, we didn't ask. Right? As a reporter, he had no contact with those women. But I have to say, the Navy, in doing their investigations, should have been asking that question. Are these women working voluntarily? So here's a potential case, which is all about bribery. Major corruption, bringing down huge swaths of the Navy, unfortunately. It's one guy, Fat Leonard, made a lot of money. This case was actually busted, interestingly enough, when a contracting officer figured out that a particular ship had pulled into port, and Fat Leonard claimed that he had pumped off something like, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but 400 tons of sewage from the ship, but the ship only held 20 tons of sewage. Right, so that was the red flag that busted the case. More questions need to be asked. All right, number 4, criminal restitution. This is actually Alex's major specialty. As I mentioned before, when traffickers are prosecuted, it is mandatory under U.S. law that victims get compensation. And again, Congress does so many things badly. They did this really well. In a forced labor case, it's kind of easy, right? You figure out what the back wages are. You calculate back wages. You multiply them by 2 to cover the liquidated damages under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And that's your restitution order, along with out-of-pocket expenses. In a sex case, it would be totally offensive to say to a child, okay, so you provided sexual services that are of commercial nature for 14 hours a day. So we're going to pay you $7.25. That's really not the proper measure for restitution. So what Congress said was, okay, we are going to make restitution the measure of the value to the defendant. That means if a trafficker charged $100 an hour for a sex act by a child, that trafficker has to disgorge $100 an hour. And this can be kind of messy in the sense that it doesn't have to be exact, right? We can, on the back of an envelope, literally say, okay, this child had a quota. I'm actually quoting this from U.S. versus Lewis, a case in the District of Columbia. This child had a quota of $500 a day, and she was held for 932 days. So we do that, and that's the best. When it works, it's an amazing thing. So most of my clients, in fact, all my clients come into the United States on legal visas. J1 visitor visas, also used for students, also used for au pairs, but also used for people who come on youth exchange programs for summer work to learn about America's culture. Unfortunately, what some of them learn is America's culture of forced labor and human trafficking. In this particular case, U.S. versus Mexico, this was a case of women from Ukraine who came into the United States thinking that they were going to work in a restaurant, in a kind of holiday center, like a vacation spot. And that's what they signed up for, to work as waitresses, etc., in a vacation destination. But when they arrived in Virginia, the traffickers immediately drove them to Detroit and put them to work stripping in a strip club. What's interesting about this case is that this is actually a forced labor case. It was the stripping that was the forced labor. There was no commercial sex that was charged. This is not a sex trafficking case. This is a forced labor case. And for the forced labor, the stripping that these women were not paid for, the restitution was $1.5 million. What's interesting about this case is after this case was prosecuted, after the restitution order was done, a big law firm, White & Case, brought a pro bono follow-on lawsuit, not just against the defendants who were named in the criminal case, but also against the strip clubs, arguing that the strip clubs were part of a conspiracy and knew or should have known that these women were trafficked and not actually getting paid. That case, like so many other cases, settled, right? Almost all of these cases resolved one way or the other. I mentioned before we were going to talk about hair braiding. This is another case in the United States. These traffickers were so unbelievably clever because they realized that people win the green card lottery. And when people win the green card lottery, it's not cheap, right? You don't just get a green card and a free ticket and come to the United States. There's a lot of paperwork, you need lawyers. So the traffickers said to people who have won the green card lottery, tell you what, we'll do everything for you, everything. All you have to do is marry this young woman or adopt this little girl and deliver them to us when we come to the United States, and people did. So they delivered all of these little girls, more than 20, to the United States, where they offer lobbies for them to work in forced labor, braiding hair, 16 to 17 hours a day. The children earned nothing, they went to school. One of them was taken across state lines and raped by one of these defendants. The restitution order was $3.9 million. All right, so what we're doing now is trying to work with the government, which forfeits assets. The government forfeits assets from traffickers. We're trying to work with the government to make sure that those assets are steered back to the victims so that they don't go to the federal treasury. All right, this is the last innovation, then I have some more challenges, and then it's time for questions, so get your questions ready. Focus on recruiting. A lot of the time, particularly in the supply chain world, we focus on, the end point, like where is this person working? But one thing that Amnesty has just done is publish an excellent report on how labor recruiting works in places like Nepal. Because by the time someone comes to the United States to work in a job that they think is going to be fabulous, many of them arrive with an enormous debt. And so they spend all of their time servicing the debt and also receiving panicked communications from their families when they stop sending money, begging them to start sending more money because the family will have its legs broken by the debt holder back in the country of origin. In Nepal, the government adopted this great new program. Everybody was so excited because it was going to regulate the labor recruiters so that the labor recruiters couldn't take money above a certain amount in order to send someone abroad. So the labor recruiters just found a way around it. So this is essentially an entire report about how regulation of labor recruiters isn't actually working yet. It doesn't just happen in the United States. This is a remarkable case involving unaccompanied minors from Guatemala who ended up in the United States on the border in detention facilities. But the recruiters were so smart that they pretended to be sponsors of these children. They went to the US government and said to the US government, and there were congressional hearings about this, they went to the US government and said, I am Uncle Joe. I am the sponsor of this child. Please release this child to me. And the government did. And when the government did, those recruiters / traffickers put those children into forced labor on egg farms. Those eggs are in our supply chain here in the US. The children were forced to live in squalor, in mobile homes, in a mobile home park. They had barely any food. There was no running water. There was no heat. They were living in Ohio. It was not warm. The case, as far as I can tell, was discovered when a neighbor felt sorry for these children who were all living together in these horrendous conditions, realizing that they had no food, took them pizza. And finally, after some time, realized what was going on. So all of these defendants were either convicted or pled guilty. There was restitution ordered, much smaller, I think, than it should have been. But these were all the folks involved in the conspiracy. So those are the things that are going on. So just going to give you just a couple of challenges, and then we can wind up with questions. One of the challenges that we have is figuring out how to make all of these folks the vanguard of the movement, because these are all survivors. More and more, the human trafficking movement is becoming survivor-led, because really no one has more expertise on human trafficking than the people who have lived through it. This is a woman named Marcela, who organized an entire conference in Colombia, her home country, with all of these survivors, and brought all of these survivors from around the world to speak in her country in Colombia about human trafficking. This is Evelyn Chambo. Evelyn is an advisor to the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and Evelyn is herself a survivor of forced labor from Cameroon here in the United States, where she was held for approximately 11 years as essentially a child slave in the United States. Her trafficker was convicted. So one sort of shift in the movement is working more ethically and more properly and acknowledging the leadership of survivors. The second is the opioid crisis. Now, this man may look like Santa, but he's not. He's actually a very dangerous human trafficker who advertised to women who were working independently in the sex industry. So these were sex workers working without facilitators or without pimps. These women were doing just fine, but he got in touch with them and said, I can help you. I have a motorcycle. I'll drive you to your appointments. I'll wait outside and make sure you're safe. So some of the women said, well, okay, that's fine. I'll pay $10 or whatever, you can do that. Except Andrew Fields worked very hard and very thoughtfully to make them all addicted to opioids. He used their addiction like a weapon, like a tool. And I spoke to the prosecutor who prosecuted this case, and he was interviewing one of the victims. And he had assumed that this was just like a case of women doing commercial sex voluntarily, and the payment was in drugs, and they were just doing it for their next hit. So he said to this victim, okay, so you were just doing this for your next hit, right? He was ready to blow this case off entirely. And this woman looked at him like he had horns and said to the prosecutor, are you insane? I was doing this because I didn't want to get sick. Because Andrew Fields controlled me and controlled Percocet and Oxycontin and all the things I was addicted to, heroin, all of it. He controlled that. I couldn't get it any other way. And he had a book in his house on withdrawal. And so he purposely would keep these women on the very edge of withdrawal. One of them overdosed at one point. He went to her hospital room, which had a camera, so this is all on film, with a bottle of Oxycontin. And he shook it in her face as she was recovering from an overdose, and he said, if you want any more, you have to go out and look for it. So he was convicted in Florida, but the opioid crisis is already having an enormous impact on sex trafficking and other forms of trafficking, mostly sex trafficking in the United States. And the last challenge is the arrest of victims. I was in San Diego recently, meeting with juvenile public defenders who were defending children being prosecuted by the local city attorney for prostitution. Those same children on the same operative set of facts were victim witnesses in federal criminal cases against their traffickers. How is it possible that someone can be a criminal defendant and a criminal victim witness for exactly the same actions? I think that would be pretty confusing to a 14-year-old. Pretty confusing to me, and I'm old. So there's now a movement across the country to deal with this, to vacate old convictions and to create safe harbors for trafficking victims so that they can't be convicted for crimes that their traffickers forced them to commit. But we have a long way to go. So let me just wrap up very briefly with one very short story. One of the sort of moments that I remember most was a trafficking survivor walking into her lawyer's office for the first time. And it was a beautiful office, kind of like your gorgeous entryway in law school there. Marble, palm trees. And the victim walked into this office with her social worker for the first time, and she looked around and she said, in awe, are these my lawyers? And the social worker said, yes, these are your lawyers, and they're working pro bono entirely for free. And the trafficking survivor said, you know, I feel like the powerful people are on my side. So that's what this is all about. This is about upending the balance of power and making sure that trafficking survivors have the powerful people. All of you, as you become lawyers, have the powerful people on your side. I'm happy to take questions.
I noticed that trafficking has lots of causes, and what we've been talking about are mostly motivated by unemployment. I'm more interested in trafficking caused by a humanitarian crisis, as a result of a humanitarian crisis. That's exactly what is happening in Africa. And if we look at what is happening with piracy in Somalia, off the coast of Somalia, we can observe that piracy, to an extent, has some form of trafficking inside, because there are people who don't have it, who are forced into that, because the pirates won't have workers working for them. If they don't force people, they have to force people to work for them, to an extent. Okay, what was recently reported in Libya, the trafficking in Libya? Libya has about 14,000 or more migrants. And what the African Union did, most leaders did, was to send them back to their countries. Sending them back is against the provisions of protecting migrants. So it shows to an extent that that particular one was not motivated by a humanitarian crisis. Okay, for humanitarian crisis, don't you think that a solution is all about preventing conflicts, for instance, rather than prosecuting? Because context matters too. In Africa, litigations do not really work, considering the length of time that it takes before court. So it shows to an extent that we have to develop strategies to prevent conflicts. What do you think can be done?
So I think that's an incredibly important point. I'm really glad you raised it. So prevention, I would rather prevent all of these cases than litigate them. I think you're absolutely right. I also think that the Europeans have been unbelievably cynical in their strategic use of the word trafficking. And so exactly what you're talking about. Some European leaders have said, we are trying to stop traffickers. That's why we're turning everyone away from Europe. That's why no one can come in. It's because they're all trafficking victims. But that's actually not true, right? They're not true. The people bringing people from Libya and Africa into Europe are smugglers. Unless they smuggle those people in with the intention of putting them into forced labor or forced prostitution, they're not traffickers, they're smugglers. The Europeans would be widely criticized if they said, oh, we're trying to stop the smugglers, because smuggling is bad, right? Smuggling is obviously not good, but it also is a method that true asylum seekers use to get from one country to another. So smugglers, while expensive and doing an illegal act, smugglers are important for people who are trying to flee conflict or flee persecution. But by using the language of trafficking, the Europeans incredibly cynically changed the entire discussion, right? Because now they could couch prevention of migrants from entering Europe as anti-trafficking, right? How awesome is that? So this one little turn of phrase, it was really troubling because the newspapers started using it, right? So first the Europeans started talking about like, anti-trafficking instead of anti-smuggling, and then the New York Times repeated it, and then the Washington Post repeated it. And so it made its way into the lexicon of reporting. I think it's unbelievably simple. So but this question of how you prevent is really difficult, right? I can give you a table of how many prosecutions there are. I can't give you a table of how many cases we've prevented. So what we do on the US side, in order to sort of try and create a regime of prevention here, just looking, for example, at the diplomats, which is one of the areas that I work in most, we've created a whole series of regulations for bringing domestic workers into the United States. There has to be a contract. They have to have a pamphlet that tells them their rights. They have to have their phone number of their own embassy. We've created this whole litany of protections to try and prevent trafficking while still allowing people to travel. Right? Because the other thing you don't want to have is an absolute shift of the pendulum to the other side, which is, oh no, women might be trafficked, as Alex said this morning at breakfast. Maybe women shouldn't travel. Right? Like that's the ultimate prevention strategy. Don't let women travel, right? So that's not reasonable, right? That's not realistic, and it's also a violation of human rights on the other side, right? So there are organizations like Free the Slaves and others that focus much more on trying to prevent trafficking, largely through building strong communities and making sure that people don't leave. The one thing I would say is if you're going to have a prevention strategy, please, 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 make it based on actual data. Right? Make it based on actual empirical, evidence-based theories of change, as opposed to what I thought of this morning, right? Like having flight attendants in people who are being trafficked. Did all of you read this case? So the flight attendants have training now to spot trafficking. So Alex was telling me this morning about a case that I hadn't actually read, of a young woman flying from Mexico to have Thanksgiving with her family, but the flight attendant saw her and saw she was Asian. They thought, oh my gosh, she's trafficked. So when this young woman arrives in the United States, she's pulled off the plane because she's trafficked, or which she's not, and she doesn't get to have Thanksgiving with her family. That's not prevention, that's disaster. That's racial profiling. It's disaster. So we have to be careful that we don't do more harm, right? To kind of do no harm theory of prevention. Any other questions? Yes, please.
You mentioned the majority of your clients are here on like J1 or other legal visas. Would the legal strategy change if you had a client who is here undocumented? Because under U.S. law, those people don't really have the same rights.
They do. That's the great part. They do have the same rights.
Okay.
Yay! There is one place where they don't. Right? So if my client comes in on an A, most of my clients have A3 or G5 visas. Those are the visas that diplomats get to bring domestic workers in. So they have an A3 or a G5 visa. If you come in on a legal visa, if you're an American citizen or documented otherwise, green card, you can get future wages. If you're undocumented, you can't get future wages because it would be illegal to work in the future. The work that you've already done, even if you're undocumented, you can be compensated for that work, and you can sue for that work. So there's a very important case with precisely that holding from the Supreme Court. So you're right in terms of future earnings. But in terms of work you've already done, undocumented migrants have exactly the same rights as documented migrants and as U.S. citizens. The place where it comes, though, the place where your litigation strategy might change a little bit is, do you want in your complaint to identify this person as undocumented? Right? Do you want in your complaint to essentially flag to the defense that this person has a visa application pending, this person is trying to get a T visa for trafficking victims? So very good lawyers like Dan Warner, but also another brilliant lawyer named Stacey Jonas at the TRLI, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid in Texas. They've done really brilliant litigation on behalf of victims who are undocumented, who are applying for T visas and U visas, to try and suppress or make unavailable in discovery the full visa applications. Right? So it's a kind of, their argument is that this has an intolerant effect. It terrorizes the victims. You don't want to identify them publicly. So the other thing we sometimes do is John Doe or Jane Doe. So that would be the other part of the legal strategy that you would use to essentially protect them. The Jane Doe strategy I use a lot when particularly I have a domestic servitude case where my client has been forcibly raped or subjected to other horrendous sexual violence. And the courts are very good about giving us Jane Doe status and pseudonym status in those cases. It's a little harder where it's an undocumented immigration case, but you can get it in some circumstances. On the sort of sex trafficking cases, all of those victims, with very few exceptions, want Jane Doe status. I mean, frankly, if you're a survivor of sex trafficking or labor trafficking, and you have children and you're trying to start a new life, do you really want an employer in the future to Google your name and pull up the complaint? Do you really want your children to Google your name and pull up the complaint? I think the answer is no. And so this is a moment when the need for secrecy, the need for privacy really outweighs the public's need or right to know. But it's a high standard. Any other, yes, please.
I was wondering if the United States are also working with their neighbors, like Mexico and Canada, to fight sex trafficking, because I guess that there are some kind of transnational organizations that they can play with borders too.
They do, yeah, that's a really excellent point. So I'll just give you one example. So Canada's a little, they're not so advanced in Canada. They're moving along, but they have a long way to go in Canada, unfortunately. However, Mexico is working hand in glove with the Americans. It's been strained recently because of the current administration, but Mexico has worked hand in glove by and large with the Americans on what are called the Tenancingo cases. So Tenancingo is this one area in Mexico, and trafficking in that area is like a cottage industry. So the young men fan out to neighboring communities, they meet girlfriends, they meet wives, they marry them, they get them pregnant, they bring them back to Tenancingo, they leave the children in Tenancingo with the grandmothers as hostages. Although it's not a hostage when you leave, you just think you're leaving the child with the grandmother, and you go with your husband or boyfriend to the United States and settle down and then bring the child up later. But that's not what happens. So the Tenancingo traffickers all along the eastern seaboard are so sly because the traffickers here live like paupers. I mean, I don't work these cases. I have colleagues in New York who do. And my colleagues in New York say, oh my gosh, the traffickers here, like lots of traffickers live super high on the hog, right? Gold chains, fancy cars. Not these guys. They ride bicycles and live in Queens, right? They send all the money back to Mexico. And there are huge mansions in this town in Mexico that are funded by sex industry profits from forced prostitution and child prostitution in the United States. Right? So forced child sexual exploitation in the United States. In those particular cases, I'll give you two examples of how the United States has worked with the Mexican government. So one is, if your child is in Mexico, you are so not cooperating. Why would you cooperate if your child is in danger? And so the Americans worked very hard with the Mexican authorities essentially to bring these children to the United States, understanding that the women couldn't cooperate in good conscience if they knew that their children might be killed in Mexico. So they shifted the children to the United States and so now some of those children are with their mothers. The second is, the United States also extradited traffickers within the Tenancingo clan, extradited them to the United States. And one of the people extradited was in a case called U.S. versus Corretto. The Corretto case was, she was called in the press the diminutive grandmother. She was this little tiny short woman who was the grandmother who ran the show. She was actually the mastermind in laundering the money. So all of the traffickers would send the money to the diminutive grandmother who would then allocate and launder the money back to Mexico. What's interesting is when they extradited her to the United States to face charges, they also extradited a suitcase of cash. Wasn't very much, it was probably $25,000 to $30,000, but it was the cash that they found when they were sort of extraditing her. So they sent her up with the suitcase of cash. Obviously, she couldn't carry it, but the cash came. What's incredible about this case, and thank heavens there was a brilliant lawyer on this case representing the victims. Corretto was prosecuted, going to prison, very long time, all good. The suitcase of cash went to the federal treasury. The victims got nothing, there was no restitution order, the entire thing was a bust. Except there was one lawyer who fought and fought and clawed the money back. So part of what we do now is claw the money back, because if there is any money forfeited, the people who make that money are the victims forced to earn it, not the federal treasury, and certainly not the traffickers who stole it. I think I'll take one last question on it. Very quick.
So, very quick question. This happened even in Finland. A lot of people had gone back home, and I ended up having to call someone and ask if that person is there, because there was some money that they were supposed to get, and they were not able to. I mean, it was a long process. So when you're undertaking litigation and when you have this kind of possession or whatever money, how are you able to make sure that it goes back to the people? I understand totally about safe harbor, making sure people live, but what happens in the past?
Right. So that's an excellent question. So in the Signal case, and in all of my cases, we're able to get T visas, but not everybody wanted to stay. Right? And some people wanted to stay, and then they wanted to go home, and then they went home, and they couldn't come back. You can get a U visa when you're there, but the U visa waiting list is like 9 years, right? So it's a long time to get back in. So I really discourage my clients from waiting. I try to bring their families here rather than have them go back. And we try and initiate the green card process so that they get a green card very quickly, and then they can immediately go back and visit their families with a green card rather than through. And then they have freedom to go back and forth. But in this question of getting money to people who are home, I'll just give you an example of how this has been handled. It's really fascinating. The EEOC did a huge case on behalf of workers in Thailand. The EEOC, it was a discrimination case. This was a national origin and race discrimination case. And the EEOC won this case on behalf of all these workers. It was a huge deal. And the companies that had exploited the workers were then required to pay. And they had to pay huge amounts of money by Thai standards, $50,000, $60,000 for some of these workers. And the EEOC realized, like, if the workers are back in Thailand, particularly in rural villages in Thailand, like, there's no way we can go back and distribute the money. So they did something totally brilliant. They contracted with a Thai labor rights group, a really wonderful organization out in California. And the lawyer there, Panita, went to Thailand. And she met with all of these workers, and she helped them all open bank accounts, and then she helped them all cash the checks. Right? The EEOC doesn't have we all have escrow accounts where we hold the money for the clients. The EEOC doesn't do that. The money has to go straight from the company to the victim. And so this lawyer from, I think it's the Thai Development Community Center, she went and made sure that everybody got their money and that everybody could cash their checks. But actually distributing money is a very labor-intensive process that you just have to do. You have to be patient, and it's really important to do it. I also try and sort of keep track of the clients. Every once in a while, you'll worry about someone. And so sometimes you can ask the U.S. Embassy to go and do a check, just a little welfare check to make sure that someone's okay, to bring the deposit, to make enough money to make an deposit. So, sometimes you do a welfare check as well, make sure they're okay, or you stay in touch with the local engineers. But my hope is that everybody in the Signal case actually eventually got their money, right? That's the prayer. It just takes time. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I'm happy to stay after.